Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Language. Today we'll be concentrating on giving you a framework to answer Paper 1, Question 5. This is the writing section of the writing question. This session is to complement your lessons with your teachers and not to replace them in any way. To begin, we'll just recap over the assessment objectives. If you remember, it's a 40-mark question, so it's half the marks on this paper is for this section. A really important question. And we need to make sure we're showing that we're communicating clearly and effectively, we're adapting the writing to suit purpose, and we're organising information and ideas for effect. The range of vocabulary, the sentence structures and spelling and punctuation should also be worked on, and that is 16 marks out of the 40. For today, I'm going to show you a structure to use when planning and writing your stories. This is a suggestion, you don't have to use it, but it is a really effective way of making sure that we are communicating clearly and we're organising our ideas for the effect of our reader. In the previous nuggets, we looked at the image-based question of this question choice. Today, we're going to look at the other choice, so the narrative choice. This can be a little bit trickier for some people because it means that you are using your imagination perhaps in a slightly different way to having an image prompt. Equally, this also gives you much more of a scope when writing your story because you have more of a choice in terms of where you're going to take it. Something just to remember and just to keep in your mind is that you do not need to write an entire story. The mark scheme is the same whether you choose the image or the word question. It does need to have a structure of a story. Sometimes the question may ask you for a beginning or the end of a story, but do not try and rush through and write a 50-page story which is not effective or not got the language features in, or you've not carefully thought about each of the words or the sentences that you're crafting for your reader. It is more effective if you write a really imaginative, detailed, full of language devices and full of effect when you've written half of maybe an entire story. It doesn't need to be an entire piece. Please don't panic and think I need to write a novel. You don't. Yes, they say write a story, but it is much, much more effective that you carefully construct your piece rather than try and rush through and write an entire story to finish it. This is guidance from exam boards, so you don't need to worry about that's just me saying that. That is from exam boards, so you are able to use that advice. Okay, so let's move on how we work with our question. So this question, write a story with the title Trapped. As I said, quite a big scope to choose from, so you have quite a big range of ideas that you could perhaps get from there. Be really careful though, when it says things like with the title, you must use that as the title. It has to have some sort of link to the title within your story. So for example, if our title was Trapped and you wrote about something completely random with nothing to do with that at all, it's not that you would get no marks, but it may be penalised against you in some slight way. That's not definite, but it is quite important that if they ask you a question, you need to make sure you are answering it. It is a prompt, as I said, but they are specifically giving you a title which they want you to link to. So just make sure that you're aware of that. Okay, so in the previous nugget, I showed you a structure to use when planning and writing your story or your creative writing piece, your descriptive writing piece. I'm hopeful that you have managed to have a bit of a practice with this, whether you just planned it using the grid or you planned it, and even better if you wrote it as well. I have said in the previous nuggets that the better your creative writing, the more confident you're going to feel, but the way to get there is to practice, practice, practice. Language is all about practice, and in particular case with writing, it will make you feel more comfortable, and it means that no matter what image or question they give you, you are able to answer it in a really confident way and in a way that you feel like you have been really effective and you've answered it well, and you can gain those really important marks. Remember, 40 marks out of 80 for this paper. A quarter of your marks overall for your language GCSE is based on this question. So it's really important that you know the importance of practice and the importance of making sure this question is a confident one for you. In terms of our plan, we already know the title is Trapped. trapped. So it might be a good idea if we start with our opening line and our end line where we linked somehow to the title. When you're using this structure, I do recommend that you do the top and the bottom first of the plan, because the things in the middle, they take more detail, and this can always be changed. Some people like to do these two last, and that's also absolutely fine. You need to find the best way for you to be able to succeed. If we're going with trapped, this is a great structure to use, but we haven't got any ideas yet. This is quite different from the image. If you think about when we looked at the image, we already knew what we were writing because it was given to us. We already looked at the image, we'd taken stuff out, we'd selected parts that we perhaps wanted to write about, so we had a starting point. We have a slight starting point, but unless you're very well practiced in planning, it may be that you'd like to plan what your idea is first, then take the idea and put it into the grid. So with trapped, what you want to do with this question, the approach that I would take, obviously we read the question first. We've decided that's the question we're going to go for. And then I would either start listing ideas that you want to use, or you can use a mind map. It depends how you want or how you prefer to plan. It could be that you come up with a couple of different ideas, and again, that's absolutely fine. All I would recommend is you don't spend too long planning. You should spend a good 10 minutes planning, because the more you plan, the better your writing is going to be. But remember, you are under timed conditions, so you do need to make sure you are completing the work as well, completing your answer. Okay, so back to planning. So first thing, read the question. Second thing, we need to come up with some ideas. So this is purely what I would do with this question. Of course, your imagination is much different to mine, I'm sure, and it is completely up to you what you write about. But for the purposes of this nugget, I'm going to go with what I would do for this question. So with trapped, I would talk about a locked room, and it is as simple as just literally writing your answers down. In a locked room, I might start thinking about what senses I'm going to use. If you remember back to the previous nuggets, we looked at the success criteria, and senses is on there. So I want to make sure I've got that in my plan so that when I write it, I am covering myself and know I've got it in there. So I'm going to use my senses in there. I'm probably going to talk about sight, and I'm definitely going to talk about the sound and the smell. In a locked room, I may have woken up there. Not quite sure how. I may be trying to find a way out, which obviously links to the title of Trapped. I'm probably going to decide who my character is going to be, and I think I'm actually going to write in third person. So I'm going to be he, adds a little bit of mystery to it, and then I may even start thinking about in my plan, okay, well, I've got my general ideas, or what's going to happen in there. I'm trying to find a way out. Does he get out? I'm actually going to think about the idea that he does, but then becomes trapped again. What I would really recommend, and I can't stress this enough, is that no piece of writing, no descriptive or creative writing, no narrative writing should end with "it was all a dream." That's a really poor way of ending a story, mostly because it does you a bit of a disservice. It makes you seem like you couldn't be bothered to finish it, or you're not quite sure what happens next. And your reader or your examiner immediately will think, oh, well, that was a waste of time. And that is something we definitely do not want anyone thinking about your hard work. So I would definitely avoid that. And I would also definitely avoid anything to do with the idea that you are out with your friends, or that you've involving things that aren't really age appropriate if you're sitting your GCSE. So things like me and my mates went to the park and we had some alcohol. That's not really appropriate for this type of paper, for this type of question. And I would avoid anything like that. That's just a bit of a side note, just because I think it's quite an easy way of people going into a story by trying to find it effective or maybe entertaining for you and your friends. But this is a piece that needs to be fitting the criteria and fitting your audience. So please avoid that. So if I end it with he's trapped again, I'm avoiding all of the idea that it's a dream, and I've planned it so I know that I'm not going to fall into that trap. Then what I do, obviously your plan will probably be more detailed, or hopefully more detailed and much more interesting. I'm sure I've gone quite basic with my plan, but this is just the purposes of the nugget to show you. I then take my ideas and think about how I would structure my story. Because I've got a story, but if I just wrote it like that, it's not going to be very interesting, and I'm not really hitting the marks that I want to hit. I'm not going to do very well. So it's about taking what you plan and using that within your planning structure. So I'm going to go with paragraphs first, and I'm going to come back to lines. Because it might be that when I start thinking about my word choices, I will use them in those sentences. And I think the way that I work it is I like to use the paragraphs first. As I said previously, it is either way is fine. I do find that lots of people who start with the opening and closing line actually adapt it as soon as they've planned it. But again, it's down to your practice and down to your preference. So if I'm going to drop in on my setting, I know that I need lots and lots of imagery. Now, in your planning of this, you're probably not going to write imagery. This is just to remind you and to show you what we're focusing on. So I've said that I'm trapped in a locked room. So my first paragraph, which is going to be about a setting, this is where I talk about the locked room. And I've already said that I'm going to talk about the senses, and I'm going to talk about the sight and the sound and the smell. And I'd put that in my plan. I know then that once I've planned it all, when I come to writing it, I've covered everything that I wanted to in that paragraph. My flashback. Now I've said that I've woken up in this room and become trapped. So my flashback is going to be a contrast, so something completely different from the rest of the piece. In my flashback, I'm probably going to talk about something much happier. It could be something from earlier in the day, it could be something from childhood. That's always quite effective if they're an adult. It could be something from the previous day. Again, it's completely up to you and whatever your plan or your idea is. That will need lots and lots of description. And I would try and get as many language features in there as possible. You're going to want more imagery in there. We love imagery in our writing, remember that. Try and get as much in there as possible, and you want almost to use the same techniques you've used for your setting in your flashback, in terms of you want your senses in there again, because your senses, if you're going to be contrasting, should be completely different. For example, here in a locked room, I'm sad and I'm scared. The things I smell might be things like decay or rotting, things that aren't pleasant. My contrast is going to be completely different for a contrast because I'm much happier. It might be that I'm at a fun fair, for example, just an idea. But your flashback is really effective when it is very different. Again, that is something you can practice and it becomes habit. So the flashback is a very pivotal part of your writing. It's clever, it shows structural technique, and it will really wow your reader and keep them engaged. Then, if you remember back, we have a noise, and then we talk about the present, so we go back to setting towards the end of the piece. I'm not going to do the entire plan for you because I know you've already practiced this plan anyway, but I think it's really important to also practice this side of the questions they give you. Sometimes people will just do the images and they'll just practice the image prompts they give you, and then they get into an exam, see the image and don't like it, and then they start to panic. There is no need to panic, there is a choice. Make sure you're confident with both. So when you're planning, this is just a very brief mind map, bullet points. You have got time before the exam now to be able to go through and plan. It doesn't matter if it takes you 45 minutes to plan at the moment, because you've got time to get that down to 10 minutes before the exams. So take the time to plan, do as many of these as possible with different questions, different images. The more you practice, the better it is. This structure will help you make sure that all your ideas here turn into a very good piece of writing. So just to recap, top tips. 1, read the question, obviously. Number 2, start brainstorming or mind mapping some ideas about this question. It doesn't have to be detailed at this point, just something that gives you a bit of an indication of where you want to go with your story. And then the third thing to do is to complete the structure grid for a piece of writing. What I would then do is I would do that and then give it to your teacher to mark. because regardless of whether you just do the structure, I'm sure they'd be really happy to look at it and give you some feedback. What they'd be really impressed with, I'm sure, is if you planned it and then gave them a piece of writing to mark. You can either do this question, but I would recommend that you do this question as a brand new one and use exactly the same process that we've just done. Read the question, have a quick mind map, and then complete the planning grid that you've been using. And as I said, if you give that to your teacher, I'm sure they'll be really happy to give you some feedback on your work.